Author Larry Schweikart, why do you use the term Patriots history in a series of your books?
It was a direct play on Howard Zinn's People's History. If he can say this is the history of the people, we'll say this is the history for all the Patriots. And who doesn't want to be a Patriot?
But who are the Patriots?
Patriots are those people who love America, even with her faults, want to see her improve, but stand beside her. I'm always asked, well, who's a Patriot? And it's easier to give an explanation of who isn't. Someone says, I love my wife. Well, you're not wearing a wedding ring. Last 2 or 3 times I heard you, you were running her down in public. Every time I see you on television, you criticize her, but you still love your wife? Oh, yeah. She's getting beat up out in the parking lot. Well, she probably deserves it. That's who's not a Patriot.
In your most recent book, A Patriot's History of the Modern World, From America's Exceptional Ascent to the Atomic Bomb, you write, whether through its products, its democratic processes, or its self-confidence, America remains the world's sole exceptional nation, which is to say, it alone has a self-written narrative that explains why the U.S. should, not just could, influence others. Why is America exceptional?
We get into this in the introduction, Dave Doherty and I. There are 4 factors that we argue make America an exceptional nation. First is common law. And the Germans started common law, but it kind of fell out in Germany sometime around 1000, 1100 AD. It was absorbed by the British, who have a common law system, and we absorbed it from them. The British are rapidly losing their common law system through the EU. That means that we are pretty much the only nation on earth who follows common law. Everybody else follows French civil law. Common law is the notion that God plants the law in the hearts of the people, that they know what's right and wrong, and that they elect leaders, as the Germans did, to enforce the law that everybody else already knows is right. Civil law kind of stems from divine right of kings, which says that God plants the law in the heart of the ruler, and he dispenses it as he sees fit. And that's really where most of these states are. So you have common law, a Christian, mostly Protestant religious tradition. I don't think too many people would argue with that. Private property rights, but with titles and deeds. And this is key. This is brought out in a book by Hernando de Soto called The Mystery of Capital, in which he argues that one of the missing things in much of what I used to call a third world was they have property, but they don't have written titles and deeds to the property that allow them to, most of all, leverage that to build businesses. I mean, when you go to start a business, one of the first things they say is, do you have collateral for this loan? And if you don't have titles and deeds, you can't prove that you have the collateral for the loan. Hence, most people stay relatively poor, without the ability to build a lot of wealth because you can't prove you have a lot of wealth. And then the 4th factor, I think everyone agrees, we have pretty much a free market system. So those 4 factors, if you look at those taken together, we're about the only ones on earth who have all 4. Some have 3, many have 2, but we're the only ones who have common law, Christian religion, private property rights of titles and deeds, and free market.
And in your book from 2011, What Would the Founders Say? Mm-hmm. A Patriot's Answers to America's Most Pressing Problems, one of the questions you ask there is the government responsible for protecting the land and private property? What's the answer to that question?
I think in a very limited sense it is, but in the general sense, and this is Jefferson's idea, not mine, Jefferson wanted to get as much land into the hands of as many people as possible. Land should belong to individuals. And of course he crafts, it's his ideas that craft the land ordinance of 1785. It says we're going to survey this Northwest Territory and we're going to get rid of this land as fast as we possibly can because the government shouldn't be the biggest landowner in America, just as the church was in medieval Europe. It should be the people.
What about the question of money supply in the government?
That's interesting. Take you back a little ways. In 1990-91, I was invited to a meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in Europe. The only time I've been to Europe was to Munich for this. And there were a lot of big brains there. And I was on a barge going down the Danube with 5 Nobel Prize winners, and I wasn't one of them. And it was Milton Friedman and Gordon Tullock and Buchanan, I forget the other two. And I had a debate with Milton Friedman, Mr. Free Market, about free and competitive money. And he was arguing that the government should control the money supply. And I'm arguing from American history in the 1830s to 1850s that competitive money will give you a sounder, more reliable economy with fewer panics.
Religion. What would the founders say?
Founders were pretty much unanimous that the government should not establish a religion, nor should it prevent the worship of any sort. Virtually every state constitution had the words God, and half of them had the words Jesus Christ in them. Many of them, up until the 1820s, still had Jesus Christ in their constitutions. So virtually all of the founders were of a mind that you needed to make sure the government did not force people to practice a particular religion. Now, to them, that was much different than saying you couldn't have a nativity scene on public property, because at the time, almost all of them were engaged in some sort of government support of churches, paying pastors, for example, having national days of prayer, having prayer services in the U.S. Capitol, things like that. So Jefferson's famous letter to the Danbury Baptists, which was a private letter and not a policy piece, in which he says there should be this wall of separation, and which, please people, there is no line in the Constitution that says there's a wall of separation between church and state. Jefferson meant that in terms of, we don't want to see the Anglican Church established in Virginia, but we absolutely don't want to prevent Anglicans from worshiping in Virginia.
Well, Professor Schweikart, with the mention of Christ, does that say that, yes, we are a Christian nation and Christianity is official?
I don't think it's official, but I think it's understood. And the example I would give is this. Virtually all of the founders were Christians. I think we go to pretty good lengths, for example, to disabuse people of the notion that Franklin was a deist. He absolutely was not. He believed in an interventionist God. The only one of the founders you could even reasonably call a deist was probably Jefferson. Certainly George Washington was a professing Christian. He was a vestryman. He took oaths, including the words Jesus Christ, once a month. So they all came from a notion that America was a Christian religion, and they structured Christian country, and they structured the government in light of that assumption. And here's the example I'll give you. When the Federal Reserve Act was established in 1913, there's not one mention in it of gold, the gold standard. And yet every single person, all the bankers who suggested the reforms, everyone who crafted the act, all understood this is operating under the gold standard. It's not meant to operate under any other standard at that time. And it's the same way with, I think, the founders.
Larry Schweikart, one more question about what would the founders say. Sure. You make the point that all the founders were what you call small government men. Yeah. What do you mean by that?
By that, I mean they all were greatly concerned that government, either through its executive branch in terms of the Jeffersonians, or in terms of the legislative branch in terms of the Hamiltonians, they were all very concerned that government could and would be abusive if given half a chance. And so they built into the system every conceivable check and balance you possibly could to keep government from acting radically and rapidly. They wanted to act slowly with great deliberation and make it very difficult for it to do things.
Patriots' History of the Modern World, from America's Exceptional Ascent to the Atomic Bomb, 1898 to 1945, just came out last year. You talk about, one of the themes is progressive versus constitutionalism, that fight.
Right.
What do you mean by that, and where do we stand today?
This originated in the 1890s. The Populist Party, which is really, I hate using these terms for an older era, but populists were more a leftist party, mostly rural, democratic, poorer. They died out after the election of McKinley. And in their place came a Republican backed wing